Hi, and welcome to Unit 9. This is topic 9.5, calls for reform and responses after 1900. This is our class activity. Let's take a look. So the learning objective is how the social categories, roles, and practices. This is society-based focus. How do they change and stay the same since 1900? So we're talking about changing continuity over time. Our skills are going to be more document-based analysis and thesis construction. Looking at our learning objective, the social roles and categories, it's focused on social interactions and organization is the thematic focus. Let's zoom into the historical developments to better understand what we're talking about. So rights-based discourses that definitely challenged old assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion during the 20th century. In much of the world, access to education as well as participation in new political and professional roles became more inclusive in terms of race, class, gender, and religion, more than ever before. So movements throughout the world protested inequality of environmental and economic consequences of global integration, which derives from colonialism, industrialization, imperialism, and the growing globalization issues here. So an era of rights. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the UN in 1948, it definitely asserts basic rights and fundamental freedoms of all human beings. So members of the United Nations push this forward to the rest of the world and try to enforce this. So, human rights are basic protections that are common to all people. And one of the goals of the UN is to investigate abuses of human rights, like genocide, war crime, government oppression, crimes against women, and they try to enforce this agreed upon document in the United Nations. The United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund is another focus, UNICEF, to provide food for children in Europe who are still suffering after World War II, as well as children who suffer from poverty around the world. The International Court of Justice, it is an international judicial body, and the original UN Charter set this up. It settles disputes over international law that countries bring to it, aka like the World Court, and the Nuremberg trials after World War II are one example. But make sure you understand here that this court cannot impugn or interfere with the sovereignty of any country, which means they can't interfere with the country's ability and right to rule over itself. This is agreed upon principles from countries who want to participate in this, and if a country agrees to the stipulations of the International Court, then you're agreeing to pay the penalty if somebody in your country breaks the international laws, right? And mainly they focus on border disputes and treaty violations. Okay, so the first social group we're talking about is refugees. And they're generally people who spread and fled from their home countries because of war, famine, natural disasters. The United Nations works through committees like NGOs, non-government organizations, and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They provide food, shelter, medicine to refugees, and you can see usually in photos denoted by the blue symbol for the United Nations. You can see that these are refugee camps. That's what they look like. Another social movement is global feminism. So in 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women outlined many rights and protections. The right to vote, hold office, freely choose a spouse, the right to access the same education as men, the right to access family planning resources, especially birth control. And by 2017, the Women's March on Washington happened, where over 500,000 demonstrators marched in protest to continue to spread the movement and the message. Some social, cultural, and religious movements. We have the Negritude movement, and that emphasized the pride in blackness and the rejection of old colonial rule, the right to self-determination, right? And there's some important members here of the movement. Leopold Sédar Senior, he wrote poems, The Beauty of African Culture. W.E.B. Du Bois, Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, they helped promote this movement by writing about the meanings of blackness in the world, which were very, very influential. We also have a movement called liberation theology, which has a religious connotation and infusion. And this combines socialism and Catholicism, and it spread through Latin America in the 1950s and 60s. Now let's remember Latin America's long history with European countries deeply rooted in Catholicism. And that's where the roots of this really take place. So they interpreted the teachings of Jesus to include freeing people from abuses, right? Political activism, the abuses of economic, political, and social conditions. This had a huge impact in Nicaragua and Venezuela. They were both impacted by the movement. Pope Francis reversed the Vatican's opposition to liberation theology, and they got some support. There were also major steps towards gender equality during the 20th century, and the percentage of women who can read and who can attend college increased worldwide. Where and when women earned the right to vote through suffrage over time, you can see the movement began at the beginning of the 20th century, right around 1900, and about 1965, 1970, you can see many countries pass legislation to provide suffrage voting rights for women. So at the beginning of the period, not many women on planet Earth had that right, but by the middle to the end of the period, many did. It's a major change. Steps towards racial equality. So in 1965, the United States of America, they tried to end Jim Crow laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It also banned discrimination in voting. This was major milestone legislation in the United States that had a significant impact around the world. Some more steps, major movement steps toward racial equality was the movement to end apartheid in South Africa. So in 1948, enforced segregation based on race in South Africa, some of, if not the strictest separation and segregation laws in the world. They passed laws requiring South Africans to carry identity documents when entering areas set aside for whites. And they were completely banned from living in certain areas, and education was only taught in white South African languages. Well, you have some major players in this movement: Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, F.W. de Klerk. And they all pushed to end the movement of apartheid. And Nelson Mandela also faced many years in prison to push this movement forward. But in 1994, South Africa held their first free elections, rejoined the UN, and Mandela, freed from prison, became the first president, South Africa's first black leader. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission developed out of this, the TRC, in South Africa, and they sought to restore and establish an atmosphere of trust in the new multicultural, integrated South Africa. Another major movement, caste reservation in India. The caste social hierarchy in India is one of the oldest social structures on planet Earth. And in 1949, there were major movements to try to progressively end the suffering of the people on the lowest form of the caste, the Dalits or the untouchables. So in 1949, the Indian Constitution outlawed discrimination against the Dalits or untouchables. And by 1953, Pakistan outlawed discrimination against the Dalits. So this caste reservation system, the government wanted to really try to push reforms. So they guaranteed that a certain percentage of government and public jobs, they would be reserved for those of lower castes. And in this way, people could they create more social mobility so people could move up this caste system, okay? And we also have human rights and repression in China. So China's improvements in their economy by promoting more free trade, they were not matched by improvements in the rights for people, okay? Still very regressive. So the Chinese Communist Party, they ruled people harshly by censoring the news, control what was taught in schools, limited freedom of speech and thought. If you go to China today and you were to sit at an internet cafe and type google.com, you're not going to receive Google, you're going to receive an error. It's heavily regulated. Freedom of information is heavily regulated in China even today. And the pushback, the progressive movement, was highlighted in the 1989 Tiananmen Square protest, which Chinese intellectuals and students, they demanded freedom of the press and other forms, and it was brutally put down by the Chinese communist leaders at the time. Also, the struggle for minority rights in China. There's 55 ethnic minorities in China, and you can see denoted on the map. And some major examples are Tibetans calling for autonomy and independence, who are also controlled by the leaders of the Chinese Communist government, and Mongolians. They're upset about the number of Han Chinese moving to Mongolia, which disturbs their pastoral way of life. So these are continuing movements. I don't know if you've heard about the Free Tibet concerts that go on in the United States and in other countries as a movement to try to push forward those progressive reforms. Finally, we have steps toward environmental repair. Repair from the environmental damage that has been done in the 20th century due to industrialization, imperialism, the negative effects of capitalism, commercialism, and the exploitation that followed. So Earth Day in 1970 was a day to focus on environmental awareness, in which they wanted to promote highlights of recycling, alternative energy, locally grown foods, and anti-pollution legislation. Also, Greenpeace was founded in 1971, and they advocated for the environment, a multinational agency, right? And they really specifically focus on the battles for global warming and also attacks on animals, endangered species. Also, the Green Belt movement was founded in 1977, and they really wanted to focus on responses to the environmental problems resulting from the colonial experience by reacting and proactively trying to repair damage done to the environment by planting trees, improve the soil, collecting rainwater, among many other things. Okay, finally, the World Fair Trade Organization. These principles of fair trade, although this is through an economic lens, it also provided connections to economic reform socially. Okay, and you can see 9 different principles of fair trade that are directly related to society and the environment. Let's take a look at the prompt. To what extent have social categories, roles, and practices around the world changed since 1990? Take a look at the documents, SOAPS Group's thesis. You have 15 minutes. Ready, go. All right, let's take a look at the documents and then the analysis, an exemplar, and an explanation. So document 1, we're looking at the highlighted underlines in red. So we have underlined colonial workers, that is drowned in blood, colonial. So that is directly related to the negative effects of colonialism. But also anti-capitalist, you can see. And now this is also a reflection of anti-capitalism. Destroyed by imperialism. So we have anti-capitalism, the destruction of culture by imperialism and colonialism. And this is through the perspective of Aimé Césaire, an Afro-Caribbean intellectual who's speaking on behalf of indigenous people from that region who were exploited, and the negative impacts of colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. Let's take a look at document 2, and this is the suffrage movement in Coney Island in 1930. I'm sorry, let's go back for a second. Let's look at the date on this because it's changed continuity over time. 1953, it's in the middle of the period. Okay, let's look at the date on document 2, 1913, the beginning of the period. We have suffrage in Coney Island, the suffrage movement for women's rights. 1913, votes for women. At the beginning of the period, women were pursuing suffrage legislation for increased women's voting rights. Okay, so we know we can make the inferences from our background context. By the middle to the end of the period, far more women had the legislative right to vote. So we know there was a major change in women's voting rights in the 20th century. So this already we can use as evidence of change over time. The beginning of the period, around 1900, like 1913 is close to the beginning of the period, women did not have many rights to vote, the legislative process around the world, but by the end of the period, many, many more did. Major change. Let's look at document 3, the speech by Wangari Maathai. Okay, the Cracked Mirror, the Resurgence magazine by Wangari Maathai, founder of the Green Belt Movement, Nobel Prize laureate, published in November 11th, 2004. And we're talking about, the red underlines, globalization and the threat from globalization and commercialization, negative impacts. The communities are persuaded to consider their relationship with nature primitive, worthless, an obstacle to development and progress in an age of technology. Negative impacts of globalization, commercialization, Also, people without culture feel insecure. Without culture, a community loses self-awareness. The stripping of indigenous culture due to globalization, commercialization, and it disintegrates from within as it suffers a lack of identity, dignity, and self-respect. Again, the negative impacts of globalization, commercialization, and you can also make direct historical connections to colonialism and imperialism. What year is this? 2004, by the end of the period. So now if we go back, so what changed over time? You have in the beginning of the period, 1913 is the inference toward the beginning of the period. Most women did not have legislative rights around the globe, but by the end of the period, many, many more did, and that is a big change. What stayed the same over the 20th century? Well, you know that in the beginning of the period, around 1900, the Industrial Revolution, imperialism, colonialism began, and that had a negative impact on the indigenous culture and society. In the middle of the period, reflecting document 1, it's still going on in 1953, and all the way in 2004 at the end of the period, there's still evidence that it is occurring and the lasting impact over time. So now we have document 1 and document 3 are the continuity over time, which stayed the same. Document 2 is the change. To what extent have social categories, roles, and practices around the world changed since 1900? Let's take a look at an argument that would get the point. Although challenges to social categories, gender roles, and practices have led to some, to a lesser extent, changes in humanitarian efforts, the impact of political and economic ideology, colonialism, imperialism, industrialization, commercialism, capitalism, continues to pose hurdles to global universal human rights to a great extent during the 20th century. Why, you ask? Let's validate this. The reason for this is because document 2 reveals at the beginning of the period, movements like women's suffrage provided ways for females around the world to challenge gender roles. But by the end of the period, women achieved legislative success in many countries through increased voting rights. That's the major change. Now, what stayed the same? Documents 1 and 3 show across the period, that means stayed the same. Colonialism, imperialism, commercialism, and globalization continued to break the human bond with the natural environment, that's straight out of the documents, as well as eradicate indigenous culture and identity around the globe. That's directly out of the documents as well. So you can see an argument that develops here using the documents. The change is women's rights increased. The continuity is the negative impact of imperialism, industrialization, commercialism, globalization over time. What to take away? Well, challenges to assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion occurred all through the 20th century, and rights-based discourses challenged old assumptions about race, class, gender, and religion. And when you see continuity and change prompt, when you see the word change inside that prompt, always focus on the dates of each document in order to group them together. I hope this helped.